Hello, everybody. This is a review recording for the A&P exam. It's going to be on Blackboard on the 14th. So everything is as scheduled. I'll give you the details either by in class and via email about how to access it and the time and the constraints, etc. There's 60 questions of the ever popular multiple choice true false. It's typical stuff that you see with my classes. So you won't be able to see anything. It's just going to be me talking. So listen, you can look at the whatever they call that, transcription with it. Start with the eye. Again, this is on Blackboard too. And so when we're dealing with the eye, things that, first of all, that LR6 SO43, write it down now. You're going to have to know those are the nerves for the extraocular muscle. You have to know what things like the lacrimal apparatus does. Everybody should be familiar with it. Lacrimal gives it away. Remember the lacrimal bone in the eye, the lacrimal duct. All of that is about tear production. It's really important. Okay, don't forget any of that. With your semi anatomy, don't forget the tunics. What's part of them? Okay, you have the outer tunic, because I mean, I realize it's anatomy, but to me, that's important as well with regard to the physiology of the eye. The fibrous outer layer is basically sclera, okay, and cornea. Cornea is clear, sclera is white. Difference is the orientation of the fibers and some of the materials and the way the proteins are put together. The conjunctiva is a covering, it's a membrane. It's really not part of it, it's external to the tunic of the eye. It's important. Yeah, it covers all of the exposed white of the eye that you and I are able to visualize. Interiorly, you have the choroid, or let's say the pigmented layer, and most of it is choroid that extends all the way till you get to those suspensory ligaments that in that sort of serrated edge area that and the suspensory ligaments that sort of protrude from that and adhere to the lens of the eye and adjust the shape, and effectively that forms what's called the ciliary ganglion, which also controls the pupil. You remember how that works. Exposed light, pupils constrict, and what happens, because effectively you're going to be using close vision, that's what it mimics, to see better in the limited light that you have, it's going to cause that lens to be more convex on both sides, rounder, if you will. When you're doing distant vision, the lights go off, the lights go back. Bigger part. When the lights go on, it constricts. When the lights go off, okay. Now you're going to use distant vision. You need to be able to see as much as you possibly can. Pupils open wide. You maximize the light coming in. What happens is suspensory ligaments actually stretch. You flatten out the cornea, and it's all about refraction or trying to get uh, whatever images are coming into the best area of your vision. Remember, rods are abundant everywhere in the eye, and particularly along the outer portion of the periphery. Any kind of light is helpful for them. Well, you need an abundance of light. When it's dark in your house or it's dark in your room, hard to see things in color. You get ideas, but to see colors vividly, clearly, you need to have a fair amount of light, and your eyes need that too. The lens is critical. It's the divide. The divide is basically from the anterior and posterior segments or sections. They're filled with fluids. The fluids are called humors. The anterior or aqueous humor, anterior to the lens, is that fluid that's constantly being produced and constantly draining out. The problem, particularly with aging and heredity, other factors, is that's where glaucoma occurs. And that can produce blindness. That can be extremely painful. That's not something you want to have, but thankfully it's treatable. There's a lot of both eye drops and other preparations that can be used. The vitreous humor we're born with, that's that big gel packet that helps to hold the retina, that internal or nervous layer where all the photosensors are, the rods and the cones, against that pigmented area. So it holds it firm, doesn't detach, improves vision, the light gets through easily, and bounces off that pigmented layer and then basically triggers the photopigments that are there. So the vitreous is important in the fact that we're born with it. doesn't go anywhere. We're not doing the post-mortem or forensic aspects of it where they utilize that to see if sometimes certain things will accumulate there that point to cause of death. That's not part of this course. So all of that's significant eye anatomy. And as you know, when I do these, just for many of you who have me before, I'm basically looking at the exam and trying to find it. Other things in the retina, we have the rods and the cones, but there are multiple cells. The rods and the cones are the photopigment, the cells that the light interacts with, whereas that signal, the photopigments change shape, that generates a signal that is then adjusted, if you will, transformed, whatever word you want to use. We call it transduction. Changing that from one type of energy to another, or changing it from one kind of signal to another signal. In this case, it modifies the electrical signal to an electrical signal that our brains can interpret. That signal goes to a ganglionic cell. The long tails, or effectively the long axons of those ganglionic cells, all come from the retina into the optic disc and exit the eye and become the optic nerve. So they're all effectively part of the retina. All of those, ganglionic, bipolar, rods, cones. There's more cells, but we're leaving it to that. Pardon me. What's more? Pardon me, what? Oh, I left my coffee cup in the other room. So I'll carry this with me. You can't miss this one. Cones, color, rods, basically black and white or shadow or grayscale. But CO for color, CO for cone. If you're missing that, I'm going to be highly disappointed. I said that in class. And of course, the only area which is absent of any kind of photoreceptors is the blind spot. That's really called, its fancy name is the optic disc, but that's the entry, bigger part, that's the exit for all those axons I was talking about before. The maximum area of vision is called the macula lutea. Lutea because it has sort of a yellowish color. And the dead center of that is called the fovea centralis. That's peak vision. That's when your glasses and corrected lenses, we're trying to point it there. Coffee. Okay. So I covered, don't forget, bad things happen typically with aging, sometimes with smoking, sometimes with diabetes, variety of other factors. I'm not sure if heredity is part of it or not. I mean, however, but we're talking about cataracts. And cataracts can be in the cornea or the lens. Those are areas, a cataract is a cloudy spot where it's no longer transparent. And it can be minor, it can be, if possible, it's a very, very successful surgery. And it can be done well into your later years to improve vision. Because a lot of times, I think of senior citizens, it's vision and hearing are really the senses that are probably affected most distinctly, and that's kind of their interaction with the world that's there. My grandmother died at nearly 100 years old, my dad's stepmom, and they were talking within the 2 years prior to her death of doing her cataracts, like 98, 97. I don't think they did them, but they were talking close to that, to the age when she finally died. Now, don't remember, refraction is bending of the light. It's 3 times, and they're not the same. When you go through something, as you might remember, what happens, because we talked about it in class, the cornea is lights coming in from outside of your eye, coming in through the cornea. That's convex. It's rounded out. The start of the lens is rounded out, so it's bent there. And then lastly, it goes through a concave, the interior part of the lens, and it's bent 3 times. The first 2, when it goes through a convexity, it tends to point it or narrow it to a point. When it goes through a concavity, it spreads it out. So it's almost like we're focusing the light, and then the last step is it goes through the final part of the lens, it spreads it out so it hits the appropriate area, hopefully. So I think that's really important. So when you're focusing on a single point, you're going through a convex area. When you're spreading it out, concave. Okay. So all of that's part of what the eyes are. Remember the whole idea of the pupillary light reflex for the ciliary ganglion. You shine some light. pupils constrict. You take the light away, they dilate, and then of course the lens makes those adjustments. Accommodation, again, something that's lost as we get aging, is that difficult. Your eyes, basically, it's like when you're bringing a fingertip or a pencil. That's how we check it. Like from a distance towards your nose, your eyes should medially or point toward the midline. Following that, gradually increasing toward the midline, and the pupil should be constricting as that goes along. Those are the kinds of things you check for to make sure those cranial nerves at 3, 4, and 6 are doing their job, because that's what they do. Okay? So that's effectively what accommodation is. We have 3 pigments for color. You might remember there we have red, we've got, I beg your pardon, we have green, we have blue, we have 1. That's for cones. For rods, we've got 1, effectively a grayscale pigment, if you want to call it that. Again, my poor throat, not up to it. And remember, the key player in all of this, when it comes particularly for rods and cones, vitamin A. Okay, we make those photopigments from a base of vitamin A. That's why it's an important part of our diet. You can supplement it. Vitamin A is interesting. If you don't know, nearly all acne preparations are a large amount of vitamin A, particularly what's called vitamin A acid. So whether it's the ones that are without prescription or some of the ones that have a lot of potential side effects with prescription, like Accutane, if you're familiar with it, that's a hyperdose of vitamin A acid. So it has impact on a lot of things. And that has more to do with what it does to fats than, let's say, we're talking about vision. But vitamin A is one of the things that we get from certain foods, and like carrots and things like that. You say to improve your vision. Okay, so again, rods to cones about 20-1. You got to remember that. That's about the eye. We get to smell. Okay, remember the cranial nerves. 1 for olfaction, olfactory. 2 for optic, for vision. 3, 4, and 6 for the external ocular muscles, and 5 the trigeminal sensation in the face, and also the muscles of mastication for chewing. I don't think there's any others. Olfaction and taste are chemical sensors, and the chemicals have to be dissolved in some type of fluid, whether in the nose it's mucus or in the mouth it's saliva. That does the job. We're able to sense a lot of different odors, by the way. I don't think you can tie that down specifically. Okay. But I've seen authors talk about from things as little as 10,000 to as much as 1,000,000, and it varies. But to me, that's not a great question, because there's too much controversy about it. And I think controversy more time. I don't think we've really fixed the number. And remember, there's about an 80% association with taste with smell. So you have to understand, what we taste, a lot of it has to do with what we smell. So to me, those two are interlinked. They're both chemical. They're dissolved. They typically involve those little free nerve endings that come in through the cribriform foramina and the cribriform plate with the first cranial nerve that really facilitates that. And again, it's a relatively primitive sense. It's tied with emotions. It goes directly back. It's the only one that goes into the cerebral area of the brain, and it's that primitive lobe called the insula. That's why it's associated with emotions. That's why it triggers memories. It's very interesting. That's why we use it for smelling salts. Whereas for taste, there's a couple. As you recall, when we looked at the cranial nerves, parts of the facial nerve, the anterior 2/3, the posterior 1/3, and some of the pharynx by the glossopharyngeal, which literally means tongue and throat. And even the vagus has some impact on it, on the epiglottis, which is that piece of cartilage that flaps down when we swallow food so it doesn't go down our trachea or our windpipe. But what happens with powerful odors, we adapt. So you're seeing it now, whether you saw it in the micro lab when you opened up those plates and, oh my God, or we did in our lab today, or certainly in the A&P lab, where some days it's just like, oh my goodness. Basically what you're doing is you're adapting to those pungent aromas so they don't overwhelm you. And eventually we're able to tune them out for a certain extent and still be able to sell things. Don't remember the big sweet, sour, salt, and bitter. Remember the fact that umami is one that it comes from, it's basically glutamate, which is an amino acid that's there. So that plays a role. Those are well-known tastes. Other things sometimes we have a taste for fatty things. Some people do. They like that. I mean, I don't know. It's more of a taste than a mouthfeel thing. I think it's a little bit different. And then heat also. I mean, it's an oddball taste. Some people can really tolerate very, very spicy foods and love it. I mean, I put hot sauce on everything. And if you don't know people like that, you will, because you're like that. And if you're like me, and it's like, oh my god, you know, when they say 1 to 10, I don't even want one with that. When I go to a restaurant that has that, but we like a little spice in our food here at home, so we use some kind of hot sauce or a little shaky shake of chili flake. That works just fine without overwhelming it. So I think that's important. Again, the 80% that smell contributes is important. And then the last of these senses that we talk about, and really is about the special senses, is hearing. Okay, and that's auditory stimuli, and that's a mechanical aspect. Okay, and don't forget, how do we adapt with that when there's overly loud sound? We have two muscles, the stapedius, that exerts a force on the stapes, those of the three bones. Remember, the malleus, incus, and stapes are the stirrups that go to the oval window, and the tensor tympani, which exerts a certain amount of tension or lack thereof on your eardrum. Between those two, about the sound going into the inner ear or adjusting the tension on the eardrum, that's how we adapt to hearing. But remember, when you have hearing over 90 decibels for long periods of time, that's going to cause damage. I made that point several times already in class. That can lead to primary cochlear damage and potentially cochlear transplants. Never a good thing. So balance disorders, semicircular canals, hearing, cochlea, that's why we call the nerve vestibular for semicircular canals and balance disorders, cochlear for hearing disorders, and that's the cochlea itself where we do the hearing, because previously we referred to this as the auditory nerve. It's the eighth cranial nerve. It is the only nerve that doesn't exit the skull area. And in fact, it buries itself in bone by way of that internal acoustic meatus. Well, of course, the external acoustic meatus is a boundary that's covered by tensor tympani, your eardrum. Again, remember, we go back, and it's the same for hearing imbalance. They call them hair cells. They're really not hairs. They're really like a kind of cilia or micro. Cilia is probably a better term than microvilli, just because I think they're a little bit longer. And remember, they're embedded in something. For balance, they're embedded in that membrane that's got those calcium carbonate, tiny pebble-like microscopic pebbles called otoliths. And again, when head moves, and we begin to see shifting, the otol, the otoliths and that thick membrane stay in place, but the hair cells move, and as they move in one direction or the other, they're going to send certain kinds of signals that inform our brain which way our head is moving. Particularly if if we're stationary and static, and if our head goes down, our head goes back up. So, because if we're not aware of that, we get dizzy. On the other hand, hearing, remember, it's the hair cells, we have inner and outer, but the inner ones are hearing, the outer cells are making adjustment. The inner ones are stationed, or they're held at their base by what's called the basilar membrane. It's their base, and they're impact, and the hair cells themselves, quote unquote, these pieces of cilia, if you will, projections, are embedded in the tectorial, tectorial membrane. And what happens is, when sound comes in, effectively, the sound comes in above and exits below. But in that middle of the three chambers is where we have something called endolymph. And we have that endolymph also, by the way, in the vestibular mechanisms of semicircular canals. That endolymph is rich in calcium and potassium. And what happens when it causes that basilar membrane to move where they're embedded, it shifts those hairs in one direction or another in that tectorial membrane where they're held. And again, as they shift in one direction or another, effectively it will open or close gates for those charged particles, and will generate sound in that way. And I think that basically covers the vast majority. I'm looking at a couple of sources, but I think that pretty much covers, and it's roughly 30 for the special senses chapter, which The Welsh whole textbook is 12, and for the endocrine, it's roughly the same, which in the Welsh whole is 13. I would urge you to look at the other PowerPoints from the Marib series, just because there's more clinical points on that, to tell you the truth, and so I think it's valuable. I like the graphics better, but that's me. But then again, it's familiarity. I've been using that textbook for teaching anatomy and physiology to a tremendous number of students over. When you do it for 25 years, you kind of like certain textbooks. It's like the Nestor textbook we use in micro, even though we don't use it anymore. Coffee break. Mm-hmm. The dog is being very quiet. On with endocrine. Endocrine are substances that are defined by being released directly into the bloodstream. This is the vast majority, so we call it a definition. And basically, they go to target organs. Okay, that's what they are. Some are amino acid. Some are protein or peptide based. Some are fatty based. That's not the big factor. They are ductless. They don't travel by ducts. They travel in the bloodstream. Okay, and yes, they're produced by small glandular structures, but understand that isn't such a unique thing. A lot of things are produced by glandular structures. You really want to think about them going in the bloodstream when we talk about it. That's more of their definition, the fact that they're ductless directly into the bloodstream. And again, we classify them, and what we see with the ones that are, we call lipid based ones, the lipid is cholesterol. No two way about it. So we call them steroidal hormones for the most part. The only oddball in this that's based in an amino acid or a protein type or a polypeptide type component, you might recall me talking about it extensively in lecture, and that is thyroid, and that's because we use tyrosine as the amino acid, two tyrosines placed symmetrically. One's right side up, one's upside down, almost like DNA. It is in an anti-parallel formation, and what do? We just tack on iodines to it. And the iodines don't have a lot of impact. Remember that the active form is T3. They're both active, T3 and T4, but T3 is significantly more active, and they're both produced by the thyroid gland. But that's a big thing. The water soluble, so the fat soluble ones are able to go directly. They're small enough to get through the membrane, including the thyroid hormone, the external or cell membrane. They will link or bond with receptors, typically in the cytoplasm, perhaps inside the nucleus. That forms a complex. So, and even if they form in the cytoplasm, they can go through the nuclear membrane, and effectively, once they are there, that hormone is released inside the nucleoplasm and immediately attaches itself to DNA and influences it in such a way that it affects transcription. Remember, transcription is DNA making messenger RNA, and translation, messenger RNA making proteins, even though that occurs in the ribosomes. So that's a very direct kind of a mechanism, whereas the water-soluble hormones, okay, and again, we're classifying thyroid on the fat-soluble side because it's non-polar, is they work indirectly because they never enter the cell. They have to use second messenger systems that are there. And we reviewed that. Things like cyclic AMP, ionic calcium can do that. And we'll look more at that. We do have some more stuff to cover. I'm trying to dedicate I'm doing this Thursday afternoon. On Friday, I'm going to try to get everything in, including diabetes. I may have to finish off a little diabetes on Monday, but that's fine because the exam isn't until Friday. So, again, all that's important. So the receptors for our purpose for now are in the cytoplasm. I think it's the best way to state it for now. Okay, and they work through transcription and translation, where the water soluble is that G protein receptors, and they work through second messengers. And there's lots of different things that can impact it. I mean, remember, this system is very elegantly controlled by a variety of negative feedback mechanisms for the vast majority, other than the one we're dealing with, that oxytocin. We had talked about with the birth canal and the use of pitocin, where it's genetically created a la GMO technique, a genetically modified organism, to manufacture that. So we make it in the laboratory. But lots of things impact it. hormone levels impacted. So as hormone levels go up, so that will feed back and say we don't need it anymore. Maybe end products, thyroid, T3 and T4, they will end product. Other chemicals, glucose, such as when we get to insulin, as you will see, that will impact the production. The nervous system is your override. Even though these are both control systems, the nervous system is sort of the master. And what this does, they can impact significantly endocrine, and nothing is a better example of that than fight or flight. Understand that. That's the big player. Most of the other ones are just examples of typically negative and rarely positive feedback type of things. You eat a big dinner, you're going to get rid of a lot. You're going to have a lot of insulin. Okay? Those are the kinds of things that happen. If you went nuts with the salt, you ate a bunch of salt, you're watching the Super Bowl and you have like a zillion chips and dip and stuff like that, you're going to retain a ton of fluid. I mean, that's more about the chemical imbalance. When we're talking about fight or flight, boom, that's the nervous system going, whoa, take over. I need to do, we're in emergency mode now. Do this, do this, do this, do this. We have the posterior and the anterior pituitary. Remember, the posterior pituitary is technically part of the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus is also considered an endocrine gland. The big guys it makes are antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. They're really considered neurotransmitters, but they go directly in the bloodstream, so they're also hormones. And we went into what they do. You should review it. And antidiuretic hormone, just that, retains water influences the kidney to retain water. Where oxytocin is the one positive feedback with vaginal birth and delivery and the birth canal. So all of that you should remember. You've got to know what I call the big six, those 6 hormones from the anterior pituitary, that glandular portion. So voila, human growth hormone, adrenocorticotropic, so HGH, ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, LH, FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and prolactin. Some use PRL typically for an abbreviation for that. And so a lot of them have a big range. HGH by far and away has the biggest range of those. Okay. The other ones are pretty straightforward. The prolactin, the luteinizing hormone, and the follicle stimulating hormone are pretty much associated with reproductive activity. With maybe some limited exceptions in other systems they affect. ACTH is strictly going to the adrenal cortex, and TSH strictly to the thyroid. Now, if I said thyroid hormone, having a range similar to a human growth hormone, that would be true. But again, thyroid hormone is not made by the pituitary. Thyroid stimulating hormone is, and that induces the thyroid to release thyroid hormone. And remember, luteinizing hormone is about estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. They're double duty glands. Their endocrine function, ovaries and testes, are to make hormones like estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone, all made basically from cholesterol. Whereas eggs and sperm are not endocrine because they travel by ducts, whether it's the oviducts or the ductus deferens in the male. We will see when we do repro. Those are ducted structures. So eggs and sperm are exocrine functions, and and you see the pancreas does the same thing like that. And so we have a name, and I forgot to give it to you, but I'll give it to you now, and I'll do it in class. I'll make a mental note. We have what's called sugar diet. I'll do it with diabetes because we're going to do that on Friday. But just remember, there's 2 types of diabetes. And years ago, they called them sugar and salt diabetes because it was about the urine. And if the urine had a high level of sugar in it, sugar diabetes. If it had a high level of salt, but not an abnormal level of sugar, they called it salt diabetes. Diabetes means the great thirst. What makes you thirsty is, for whatever reason, you're losing water. And when we call diabetes, we're referring to something called diabetes mellitus, small mellitus. What happens there is our kidneys are spilling out glucose when it's out excessively high. What happens because of that, we get rid of more water, so there isn't an it's almost like so much glucose would literally crystallize, and you end up with a lot of problems in the urinary tract. So it effectively draws water with it along its way. Any solute will draw water because the kidney's trying to maintain at all possible the concentrations necessary to keep the urine where it's supposed to be from a concentration standpoint. So it's called the great thirst because you're losing water, and you're going to see that it's not the only thing, but that's the big thing that's associated with it. Plus you're hungry, plus you're tired. Okay, so you're thirsty, you're hungry, and you urinate a lot, and you're very tired. Those are the major signs and symptoms that we associate with, okay, diabetes mellitus or sugar diabetes. And I'll go into that at length. That's tomorrow. So if you're listening to it, you may have gone into it already, depending on when you choose to listen to this. On the other hand, diabetes insipidus, INSIPIDUS, is salt diabetes. And interestingly, it involves antidiuretic hormone. So again, what does antidiuretic hormone do? Antidiuretic hormone prevents you from losing water. Okay, so what it does when we need to retain fluid, not have enough fluid in our bloodstream, or our blood pressure is starting to drop, we secrete this aggressively, as you will see, as we go into kidney and things like that as the semester goes on, and it inserts little channels in the urinary tract to reclaim water and bring it back into the bloodstream. What if we're not making this stuff sufficiently? Big problems. So you're losing water, but in this case, you're not only are you losing water, you tend to lose salt with it. Because salt and water, for the most part, with the exception of sugar diabetes, kind of go together. So and what happens is the urine is, for whatever reason, has a higher level of concentration of salt and does not have abnormal sugar concentration in it. That's called diabetes insipidus, known as salt diabetes. But how do you manifest it when you're losing water? Thirsty, hence the great thirst. So understand, names are funny like that. You'll see at micro, we talk about emphysema, as we will in this class. Okay, with respiratory problems, chronic respiratory disease. Emphysema doesn't mean your lungs. Emphysema means trapped air. And there's other things that make air get trapped, because air doesn't necessarily mean oxygen type air, as you will see. So we go on. Names have to be very specific, or you have to give context. So remember, we did a whole thing on goiters. T3 and T4 have to have iodine. If you don't have it, they're goiters. Okay. Thyroid hormones affect nearly every cell that's there. And then we have a couple of things we didn't get to yet as I'm dictating this, but I'm happy to, let's say, go over them with you as we speak. So you may not have a context just for this if you're listening to this soon, like tonight or tomorrow, but you should be listening to it multiple times. We're going to look at, next to the thing we look at is the adrenal cortex. There are 3 layers. The outermost layer, they're called zonas. There's glomerular, and we'll look at them in class. You don't have to know the names. Glomerulosa and reticularis and whatever the hell it is. But there's 3 layers. Outermost, aldosterone. The middle one, cortisol. The inner one, interesting, those are androgens, male sex hormones. The only place where women produce male sex hormones, meaning testosterone-like substances, is in that innermost of the 3 layers of the adrenal cortex. We'll see it in something. And aldosterone, again, we talked about it a little bit. That's sort of the opposite. It's an interesting, now opposite's the wrong term. It's an interesting effect that pulls water into the system. So it's similar to antidiuretic hormone. Often they're being utilized together under certain circumstances when people are really have to retain fluid, almost like an emergency, and have to control their blood pressure. But aldosterone puts little channels in the collecting areas of the urinary system, and we'll go over that with the urinary tract to be more specific. And what that does is it pulls sodium, and then, as I told you, where sodium goes, water is typically sure to follow. Stein's Mary had a little lamb rule. So what does it do? Aldosterone increases sodium retention by the kidney. Okay, again. So the big one is, we'll go over this because we're doing this first thing tomorrow. There's something called a renin-angiotensin mechanism. The kidneys sense blood pressure being lowered, and they produce a chemical called renin. And that renin goes all through the system, and it activates a chain reaction that I'll probably outline when I cover this, and we're going to go over it several times. We do it in blood pressure, we do it in kidney. And what it is eventually one of the endpoints is to generate aldosterone, which has a very significant effect. We can't lose sodium. We rarely worry about sodium levels unless we start to really lose them, and there's a problem with this mechanism. So again, the only place where we see testosterone or androgens or androgen-like substances is within the adrenal cortical area, period. That is important because they play a role in maintaining red blood cell counts in women. They play a role in sexual development as well. Not inappropriate. There's a lot of factors that are involved. So we don't understand quite all of them, I would say, but there's a lot that are important. It's one of that. The fact that women that's the only place where women produce testosterone-like substances as opposed to men who produce it not only there, but in vast amounts in the testes. And it's one of the reasons why women's red blood count, because it will have an impact on producing red blood cells, and women's red counts are typically a little lower. We're going to do that in our next chapter on the blood. So I'll reinforce it then. Insulin is produced in the pancreas. They're called the islet cells. Fancy name is islet, of its proper name called Langerhans, capital Langerhans. And there's two. There's alpha and beta, and the beta cells produce insulin. The alpha cells produce glucagon. They both work. They're sort of the yin and yang. They work in concert in glucose metabolism. Glucagon acts on the liver and elevates blood sugar. It releases blood sugar. It's actually, if you want to think of it, even though we see it in emergencies and fight or flight, where it really is very, very notable, even during normal business, without fight or flight, just ingesting a meal, not only do we release insulin, we release some glucagon, because insulin can produce sharp drops and sharp elevations in sugar levels. We need something to sort of soften that severe ups and downs. That's where glucagon comes in. So you'll see, as I'm fond of saying, living systems don't make sharp turns. We usually have something, when we're releasing one thing that has a profound effect, we're typically releasing something else to sort of soften that effect. And so when we see irregularities in glucagon and insulin, very often it starts to point us early on to a condition called pre-diabetes, which means you're at risk of having diabetes, and physicians and clinicians and nurses take note, because in the back of your mind, if you have information on the chart to suggest they have features of pre-diabetes, start to see signs of it, it can be early on. We're seeing a lot of it. We'll get into all of that. Whereas insulin acts all over. It's like human growth hormone. It's almost like the anti thing to human growth hormone. When we're using insulin, we're not using human growth hormone. Using human growth hormone, we're typically not using insulin. So it acts all over, and it lowers your blood sugar. Glucagon acts in the liver, and it elevates your blood sugar. So that's what I mean. They're softening the severity of the changes. Type 1 diabetes has to do with problems vis-a-vis insulin. Okay? So by and large, it has to do with a fault in insulin production. Not enough, not the right insulin, whatever way to do it. There's a fault that's there. Whereas when we talk about type 2 diabetes, and I'm going to go into this next time, what this is and why we no longer call them youth onset or maturity onset diabetes, okay, or insulin dependent and non-insulin dependent diabetes, is because, okay, we're seeing type 1 diabetes come later, and we're seeing type 2 diabetes come earlier, particularly. That's a big problem. Type 2 appears to be problems with the insulin receptors and inappropriate responses by them. And that's something we're finding out more and more has to do with lifestyle changes, with dietary changes, etc., etc. So, I mean, we're going to get a lot into this. There's going to be more in lecture than there is on the test, because you can't know enough about diabetes. So typically the big players that call your attention to it, if you have high levels of blood sugar, blood glucose, and frequency of urination, somebody comes to you with that as a principal complaint, that they're urinating all the time, and you do a blood glucose level randomly and it's like 150 or more, it's like, oh my goodness, now we have to start testing for diabetes. There's other tests, we'll get into that are there. The big problem with diabetes is effectively you can't utilize sugar, so you have to utilize fats. And it's just what I was telling you about with HGH. When you're utilizing fats, you get these harmful byproducts called ketone bodies and keto acids. And it's magnified with anything along those lines, whether you're using steroids, but particularly in diabetes, and it predisposes them to inflammatory changes and damage in blood vessels and in small organs and in capillaries. So where do we see these? In the eye, leading cause of blindness; in the kidney, leading cause of kidney failure and kidney transplants in patients on dialysis. Okay, leading cause of amputations in diabetics was those blood vessels get clogged, they don't work, and the circulation gets to areas that normally have problems with circulation as we age, particularly the lower extremity, legs, ankles, feet. Okay, and the fatigue aspect for any of these types of diabetes is it's not the glucose, it's the fact that the glucose is in the bloodstream, not in the cells, and therefore we can't adequately make ATP inside the cell. It's a big problem. That's where the energy comes from. I mean, that's glucose drives the engine. Okay, so if it's high in the cell, hopefully we anticipate it's going into the mitochondria and doing energy transformations, assuming there's enough oxygen present. So it's not about the blood glucose level; it's about the ATP production. We'll get into some other hormones. I touched on it that plays a role in puberty, and particularly more so, though it could be the same thing in males. We particularly see the problem in females, and you have to have adequate fat levels. You have women, you optimally should have. I mean, the range is 5 to 15%. Closer to that 10 to 15 is a lot better than closer to the 5. I will tell you, for reproductive health. And that's something you have to take into concern. That we reinforce this discussion when we talk about repro at the end of the term. I have a lot of opinions about it and a lot of anecdotal things that you might find interesting. But that fat hormone that comes out of fat is called leptin. Okay? And we're not completely done. Okay, one oddball one, just touched on in passing, is the thymus. That plays a role in your immune system, developing white blood cells. And lastly, we have a check and balance when we're retaining too much fluid. And we're going to cover this again when we get to the heart. When you have too much fluid in your bloodstream, it tends to stretch muscles in the heart if they're being overloaded. The atria, the upper chambers in the heart, when they stretch, they release a particular chemical. It's not the only one, but it's called ANP. A is in apple, N is in Nancy, P is in Peter. And it stands for atrial, the smaller upper chambers of the heart, natriuretic, I'll spell, NATRIURETIC, peptide. Well, peptide is the nature of the hormone. Atria is where the muscles are stretched in the heart and the lining cells secrete this. The natriuretic tells you what it does. It basically is the anti-aldosterone. What it does is it causes sodium to be put into the urine, where aldosterone pulls sodium back and water follows. This, if there's too much blood volume, is the check and balance for it. It pushes sodium into the urine and the water follows to lower blood pressure. So all of that is significant. I don't think there's anything else to add as I'm looking at it as we're speaking now. If there is, I will do an addendum to this or send it to you by email and comment on it in class. So thank you very much. This concludes our review, and I will send it to everybody. Thank you very much again. Bye-bye. Review for test 1, AMP2.